When you do messaging work before you've done your persona or audience work, you're acting on your internal bias, what you think your audience wants to know or how you think they interpret the problem. That's where we can get really off kilter because we know too much about our product, but it's not your audience. And so sometimes we really forget that we are not our audience. And if we try to use what we think as the foundation for building messaging and positioning, we can really be off the mark.
Driving sustainable growth for a B2B company can be daunting, especially when trends in marketing are evolving so quickly. The road to success is continually under construction, so you have to be on the lookout for new insights to help you drive growth. Welcome to Trend Spotters. Our goal is to provide practical wisdom through brief conversations with B2B thought leaders to help you grow your business. Here's Candace to introduce today's guest.
Effective branding and messaging have to be closely aligned to how your buyers perceive their needs. Whoever understands the customer best wins. But a lot of firms get this backwards. They launch branding initiatives without first doing their buyer research. Then they do the buyer research and realize that their messaging is not going to resonate with their target market. This is both counterproductive and expensive, and there is a better way to do this. Today, I'm talking with Ardath Albee, the CEO of Marketing Interactions. Ardath is a noted expert on buyer research and marketing strategy. In the podcast, we discuss why doing branding without effective buyer personas can render your messaging irrelevant or, at a minimum, out of step with your buyers. We'll also talk about how account-based marketing and your ideal customer profiles can work together, but why your personas are still necessary to an ABM messaging strategy. Finally, we'll cover some tips for doing ABM at scale and using personas for sales messaging. So now, let's dive into the conversation. Thank you for joining me, Ardath. I'm so excited to have you on the call today.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So one of the things we wanted to talk about today is how organizations can prioritize the marketing and sales efforts and try not to get the cart before the horse. And I know that you have a story of a company that did just that. So can you share more about what happened?
Yeah, one of my clients, an enterprise IT company, decided to do a rebrand and kind of a reorganization a little bit and launch some new products. And I've worked with them for a number of years, but taking this new direction, they did all of that and new messaging, new taglines, new logos, new everything, and then called me and said they wanted to build personas. So cart before horse, And so what we're finding out, of course, is some of the messaging they've put together and some of the things they were thinking are not really going to resonate with the target market that they've focused on. So we're having to go back and rethink and redo, which is expensive and is counterproductive, actually. But when I asked why they chose to do that in this way, because we've worked together, they, in my mind, they should know better. But it was all about the CEO wanting to get everything to market, to speed it up, to get stuff done. And so the prioritization that should have been there just kind of fell by the wayside. And as they checked off the boxes, they got things out of order. And so when you do that, you don't have a solid plan and a strategy. You end up having to do rework because you miss something that probably you would have seen had you done things in the right order, like get to know your audience first and then build out your messaging strategy.
So I've got a client that's doing some similar things where they brought me in to do persona work, but at the same time, they brought in a consultant to do messaging, which is a little premature because the buyer persona work that I am doing and the information that I'm getting from interviewing their actual customers is actually contradicting the work that they're doing on the messaging part, which is, like you're pointing out, it's getting the cart before the horse, and it's a huge waste of money.
It is. And, the other thing that's interesting is when you do messaging work before you've done your persona or audience work, you're acting on your internal bias, right? What you think your audience wants to know or how you think they interpret the problem. And so that's where we can get really off kilter because we know too much about our product. And then we think we know how, in quotes, a reasonable person might look at the problem they're solving, but it's not your audience. And so sometimes we really forget that we are not our audience. And if we try to use what we think as the foundation for building messaging and positioning, we can really be off the mark.
Yeah, and it can be nuance that is what's off the mark, I'm noticing, because in that particular situation, but I've found it over and over again in the buyer persona research, is that the way that the buyer articulates value or thinks of the ROI for the product is usually an order of magnitude smaller than the way the vendor perceives the same value. And the vendor thinks that that value is too small, but in fact, the customer does not. So the way that you articulate the value proposition, if it's not aligned with the way that the customer articulates the value proposition, you risk being not credible.
Mm-hmm. That's true, because you're off context.
Inbound isn't quite as effective and is certainly costing more today than it used to. I'm also finding that they're wanting to, using John Miller's language, hunt with spears instead of nets so that they can go after those ideal customers. You've mentioned some things about that in the past, about the difference between a persona-based strategy and an ideal customer profile strategy. Can you talk a little bit about that and what you're seeing firms do right and wrong about this and where they're wasting money and time?
Account-based marketing isn't new. I mean, I've been doing it with my clients for years and years, and I've always marketed that way. It just wasn't called that. And so, essentially, if you're going after companies that fit your sweet spot, the right kind of customer for you, and you're marketing to the different people involved in the buying decision, you've been doing account-based marketing, essentially. Although you may not have called it out and said, I'm going after these 10 specific accounts, but you've been doing that kind of marketing. What happened when ABM came to the fore is that a lot of, in quotes, gurus or people talking about ABM thought that the ideal customer profile, or ICP, would replace personas, because now you're marketing to an account and not a lead. That's the reasoning. The problem with it is the ICP, the ideal customer profile, really defines what kind of company is your ideal customer, right? Based on the technology they use, the size they are, the amount of revenue they make, perhaps the industry they're in, their geography, all of those kinds of things that are about the company. The problem with that is that the people who buy, or the roles, are still the personas that you have to sell to. And if you are somebody sitting in an HR department versus somebody sitting in an IT department, you're both talking about solving a problem, your perspective on how you would solve that problem is going to be different based on the way whatever the issue is impacts your role, your department, your team. And so if you just try to market to the company, you're not being relevant to the specific roles. The depth of context isn't there. And so it's really hard to get everybody on the same page. Now, I've also heard it argued by different people that if you market to personas, then you get everybody telling these different stories to these different people, and they're never going to be able to agree. And I totally disagree with that, because I think if you are engaging each persona based on their perspective and showing them how their perspective relates to the others, then you can help them actually have the conversations they need to have. I think ABM is great. I think it's the way we should be marketing and selling. I just think we've gotten ourselves all wrapped around the axle with this new acronym and people trying to make up new processes around what's really just solid marketing.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think that in addition, companies are getting wrapped around the axle about how much personalization and how much segmentation is realistic. Mm-hmm. And that's a big challenge. I mean, for sales, they really have to go have a very specific conversation with a specific persona from a specific account. Marketing is having trouble figuring out how to do that at scale. What are you seeing that's working?
Well, I've been applying what I call pivots, for a lot of my clients to help them manage scale. And what that means is that when you do your persona research, quite often there are a lot of areas in the conversation where the different personas need the same information, just perhaps packaged a little differently. So they all need to understand some basic tenets about how to solve the problem. They just need them presented in a context that matches theirs. So if you create one body of information, you can then spin it to address the perspectives of 5 different personas that you're marketing to or who are involved in that conversation. And so it's taking information and figuring out how to present it differently for either the persona or the industry or what have you, instead of reinventing the wheel every time. We need to think about content in a way where it's repurposable at scale. Instead of creating one piece of content, we should already have a plan for 10 pieces that will roll off of this. Whether it will be applied in different formats to different industries, to different personas, it should all be in that plan instead of producing one-off assets. And as long as we continue to look at this as one-off asset land, we're never going to be able to scale. I think it all just begins with your knowledge of your audience.
So just kind of taking a step back in terms of what is a persona from your perspective and why are personas so crucial? And what's the difference between a persona and the typical customer profile that an advertising agency might do? I'd like you to just kind of talk about that a little bit to give the CEOs that are listening to this some perspective if they're not that familiar with what we're talking about.
Well, sure. A persona is a composite sketch of a target market. Okay. So it's built on real people, your real customers. But what you're looking for are the commonalities that work across them. You don't want to know that, hey, Tony drives a Corvette, so let's market to men who drive Corvettes that are directors of IT. That's not going to help you. What you need to know is Tony's been in IT for 20 years and he really worries about how much he can mentor his team. And his goal is to increase the efficiency of his team and get them working on more strategic things instead of tactical things. So let's just say that's a summary of Tony. So then when you have that information, you can apply perspective, right? Talk about how much his team's going to get out of it, how much he'll be seen as a leader for helping them achieve whatever it is, and how to address efficiency or what have you. So you get those insights from a persona. The problem that you have is that people think that a title is a persona or that they have 52 personas, when in essence, most companies have maybe 5 to 7, 8, 10 tops. And I say that because a persona is not based on a title, it's based on a role. So I have created personas where maybe there's a dozen different titles that could fall into that persona category. But because of what they care about and their objectives, it's really one persona. I think this is where we get ourselves stuck on segmentation. We think we have to break everything up by title. And part of the problem is the way we collect information, right? So we ask for title on a form. But if we don't understand that these 6 titles are this persona, we don't segment appropriately. So then we're running around trying to create content for 52 different personas when really we only need it for 8 or 10. Do you know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So you need to look at the problems they're solving, the perspective they have, and the objectives they have, and say, okay, this rolls across these different titles. And the same information will serve the needs of people who care about this stuff. Because it's a multiplier, right? If you have 5 personas and you need to touch them 10 times before they move through the buying cycle, that's 50 pieces of content. Just that alone, not counting website, not counting social media, and then break it out into industries. Let's say you add 4 industries to that. Now you're up to 200 versions, right? So it's a multiplier. And I think we get ourselves either overwhelmed with the multiplication factor, or we think, okay, that's too much. We're scaling back and doing less. And then we don't do it appropriately because we're not looking at really the roles. And the other thing we don't look at too is almost everybody I talk to says they need to engage a C-level person. C-level people don't want to talk to marketers. They're not out there trolling the web most of the time. But we have to really make sure that we're spending our time and our energy working on engaging people we can get to. Some of my clients have subject matter experts that are known in the field that can engage, that can create content that would engage a C-level. Most of them do not.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Ardath, one of the challenges that a lot of companies I've been talking to are having is how to then get a conversation going and get somebody engaged when I agree, it doesn't need to be the CEO, but we do need to find a way to engage the right person. And at least in the companies that I work with, they're not starting their path to purchase on Google. They're starting their path to purchase by talking to other people, by reading something in the press. So we are using PR to try to get out there. But are you seeing other techniques like direct mail or something like that helping to get a conversation started with the specific targets that somebody might be looking for?
Well, yeah. Since ABM has come to the fore, direct mail is back in vogue again. And most people who are doing direct mail are doing in-person events. They're doing direct mail to get people enrolled in conversations or to show up for lunch and learns or executive briefing dinners or, what have you. But events and direct mail are back in vogue with ABM because you're targeting a smaller group of people. They're spending more money to engage them because they're the right people to engage. I'm also seeing industries that are coming around to content marketing whose audiences clients are geared for direct mail, which is something that a lot of us haven't seen for a long time. So industrial clients, for example, their audiences are looking at industry magazines to see vendor ads, for example, is what I get told in persona interviews. They want direct mail because they're out on the plant floor, and even though they have a smartphone and a tablet, they don't spend a lot of time on them except for looking at, the running of the line and data for what's going on in the plant. And so they're the people who still grab the manual off the shelf, if something goes south with a product that's running the line, instead of going online to look up a YouTube video, then find out how to fix something. You know what I mean? Most of my clients are IT clients or, some kind of modern industry. And so when you start looking at these other industrial clients who are now realizing they need to put customer before product, it becomes really interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting. I've noticed a transition in terms of who is buying our services today compared to who bought our services 5 years ago. 5 years ago, we would get calls from CEOs saying, we need content marketing. Can you come in and talk to us? And today, the CEOs that we're talking to have not heard the term inbound marketing. And I find that fascinating that the industry has transitioned to finding these new companies that haven't really experimented with content marketing before.
Yeah, I haven't had that experience with people not knowing about content marketing. What I am seeing is that the people who are making the decisions are a lot younger. And so they may know about things, but they don't know as much as they think they know. They're trying to make decisions without having enough information. So most of my clients, the people buying my services, even though I might get originally hired by the CMO, I'm doing extended work and projects with people who are in their 20s, maybe early 30s. You keep hearing about the millennials coming up and how many of them are becoming decision makers and that kind of thing. And it's not unusual anymore for me to run into a VP of marketing who is mid-30s and hasn't had a lot of experience actually executing these programs that they're now in charge of running. And so I think that's one of the reasons why people say, yeah, we have a strategy, but no, it's not documented, or we don't really understand our audience. The other thing I see a lot of is job changing. I have clients where I'm going on to my 6th company with them in the last 6 or 7 years. And so they just keep moving. Well, then they have, there's a learning curve that goes with that. You go to a new company, you have to learn a new product, a new audience. It's good for me because I get brought on to help them do all of that. But it's also interesting when you read the trends of the war for talent. How are we going to make sure we have the right talent? How do we even hire the right talent? And how do we keep that talent? And so people shift jobs very quickly these days, where in the past, you could spend your entire career at one company just working up across divisions and seniority levels and that kind of thing. But now you see people moving around, and not even moving around within the same industry, moving from industry to different industry even.
And thinking about those two trends, one, millennials being in the decision-making roles is interesting to me because you were also talking about the buyer personas on the other side of that being maybe old school, especially in the manufacturing industry. So the millennial needs to get their heads wrapped around a buyer persona that's not using their phone to find answers.
Mm-hmm. That's definitely one of the challenges. But the other thing that happens is people who have done their personas 5 years ago need to realize that they need to update. Right? I just had a client realize, oh my God, one of our personas doesn't even exist anymore. It's been replaced by this other role. And yet it caught them unaware. And now we're building that persona. But until they really dug into the data, they weren't really cognizant that anything had changed in the makeup of their buying group.
Interesting. And when you're doing personas and redoing personas for a given company, how much change do you find over the course of a year or two in the persona needs? Or is it more that you're seeing them every 5 years where the change can be more radical?
Well, it depends on type of company and industry. In technology, I see more change than I do in industrial clients, for example. It really depends on what you're selling. I remember when I was running a tech company back in 2000, it's only 17 years ago, and it was all custom install. We didn't have SaaS platforms then. Now look, everything's SaaS. You wouldn't do a custom install unless you really had a specific reason to want to do that. Everything's cloud now. We didn't used to have cloud.
It's all coming out of the operating budget budget and not the capital budget too.
Right. So things have shifted. And so that means responsibilities also shifted, roles shifted. You had mentioned nuance earlier, I think, and it's nuances of things that change. And so there's these little shifts in perspective. But if we don't update the narrative we're sharing along the way, it's obvious because it doesn't feel like we're keeping up with them. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
If they're interacting with your content and yet your story hasn't updated a little bit. For example, take IoT. How many of us have actually incorporated IoT into messaging? I got a question during a persona interview the other day where somebody was asking, how is IoT going to affect this? And I didn't have an answer for them because I'm not sure my clients addressed it. But their customers are thinking about it. So that's why we need to update our knowledge on audience and update our buyer personas. It's like, what are those new questions that people are thinking about? Even if they aren't yet sure it's going to change anything they're doing, people are thinking ahead. And so we have to figure out what are the things they're thinking about and how do we address them so that they can see that we are going to continue to help them meet their business goals as things shift over time.
Yeah, and let's talk about how this affects sales, because I find that the buyer personas can be really profound tools for the sales department if they're framed in the right way. And that is a perfect example of framing the message and being prepared for questions that the customers, they may not think to ask during the sales process, but if the salesperson doesn't bring it up and the competitor does, you have the potential of losing the opportunity or at least not being considered as competitively strong as the other guy, depending on, other criteria that come into play. But how are you helping companies from the sales perspective leverage these buyer personas and leverage the nuance that needs to be integrated into their sales conversations?
So salespeople aren't really embracing personas. I mean, they're glad for the additional insight, but they think they already know their buyers pretty well. As long as your salespeople have been around for a while, they're not really embracing personas, but here's what they are embracing. Most of the work that I've done lately has been helping them to improve the relevance of their email communications and their phone conversations. And so I don't know about you, but every day I probably get 30 or 40 emails from salespeople saying, do you have 15 minutes so I can tell you about my company?
Yep.
Well, what do I care? Right? I'm going to give it 15 minutes of my time so you can talk to me about your company instead of presenting an idea where they think they can bring value to me that I might be interested in discussing. So I've been helping my clients' sales force figure out how to create emails that actually address the needs identified in the personas. How can they reach out with some kind of valuable piece of information and then offer to have a conversation providing insights around that to prospects who would be interested in that conversation? They're having tremendous results. Instead of, one example is I had a sales manager come to me and say, here's what we do now. And he showed me this 4-email series, which basically was, give me 15 minutes to tell you about my company, just checking in to see, if you're interested in doing X, Y, and Z. It was a series of that. And then
about that 15 minutes, right?
Yeah. It was all that kind of stuff. And it was just like delete immediately. I said, nobody even reads past the 4th word. So we started redoing them and they're actually getting in multiples of conversations more than they used to. Surprise, surprise. But the thing was, we had to also work on, so what does that conversation look like? So we didn't get them on the phone and then dump them in a mess, right? Where they couldn't have the conversation. So we not only gave them education about that, but also said, and here are 3 or 4 resources that you can pass on after the call to, try to continue the conversation or what have you. But they're getting a lot more response because they're offering something valuable that their persona sees as valuable. That's how I think personas can really help sales.
Yeah, we were just working with a client recently that had a trial that was getting a lot of adoption. I mean, they were getting like 100 to 150 new trial downloads a week. And this is a pretty small company. And they had this nurture program that it was like, I think it was a 7-day trial. And so they sent a nurture email about once every other day during the trial. But not once did they think about what the customer's trying to do with the trial or facilitate using the trial more effectively or think about what the customer was trying to accomplish. It was so company focused. And by the way, your trial's about to end. You better hurry up. Let's schedule a sales call. Let's think about this from the customer's perspective and get the salesperson involved and try to engage in a conversation, but not because the trial is expiring. Let's teach them how to use it.
That's what a lot of people don't get is with a trial program, you have to create an onboarding program for your trial program.
Exactly.
And say, here are 3 fun things you can do right away with your trial product, and here's a couple other things, and here, take a look at how so-and-so is doing this with it, and, stuff like that. But you've got to engage them in that 30 days or 15 days or 7 days, however long the trial is for. And a lot of companies don't get that. They think, okay, they downloaded the trial. Now we need to get them in a conversation and sell them. But they need to be able to use it. And so I just helped a client whose tool was a great tool, except that if you went and downloaded it to do a trial and you didn't talk to anybody, you couldn't use it because you couldn't figure it out. And so we went and had to create resources that actually back it up and say, okay, here's how you walk through this. Here's 3 use cases that you can easily set up and do yourself so that they could actually see the value, and then they'd be willing to be on a call.
I just signed up for a product called Acuity Scheduling. That's what you use to schedule this appointment. And they are brilliant with that trial nurturing process. They're funny. They've got just a great tone. But I found the nurturing both in the app and then the nurturing that they were sending me via email. They even sent me chat messages while I was in app to see if I needed help. And it was clear that it was all automated, but it was so well done and so thoughtfully done. And it's easy to say, wow, that's good. It's harder to actually execute on something like that. And I'm sure that took them a tremendous amount of time to put it together. But I think I'll interview them because it'll make a fun podcast interview about how they approached that. It's brilliant if you ever want to test out that product.
Yep, and stuff like that, you're right, is really hard to do. It's trying to orchestrate all those different processes and then remembering. I just had a client change websites and change URLs even, which is unusual. But the things that they forgot to move, so it's like, okay, we have the downloads up on the new website, but if you download something, the thank you page gets pulled from the old website, so you're shifted over there.
Oh, man.
And you know what I mean? And so there's stuff that we didn't even think about or that they failed to test. When you fill out a form, it's linking back to the other site. There are just things that didn't get moved over appropriately. And there's trigger emails. If you take a certain action, Marketo triggers a follow-up, and the resources that trigger with the follow-up weren't moved. So you've got this mess of stuff going on. And so we finally got it almost all sorted out, but all the things you forget about.
The amount of planning that it takes to do something like that just cannot be underestimated. No matter how much you think you're overestimating the amount of work it's going to be, you're still going to miss things. The fact is that it's incredibly difficult to plan all of those moving parts.
Well, yeah, and the more and more content we get out there and the more and more interactions we create, and then if you don't have everything documented, right, so you can follow up with it. If you don't remember, or the person who did it originally is no longer there, things just fall through the cracks. And so part of this whole content marketing thing and personas and everything else is really showing how important governance is. And we talk about governance a lot, but we don't really do it because, we're in a hurry getting content out and everything. But as things keep multiplying and we get more and more assets out there and more programs running and everything else, there's just a ton of stuff that trying to remember isn't going to cut it.
Yeah, and this kind of stuff has to be budgeted for. And I think that it's really easy to focus the budget just on the things that are going to generate an immediate ROI. How many leads is that going to bring in? Well, no, governance is not going to bring in leads. I think that the focus on marketing having to generate an explicit ROI has caused people to table important parts of the marketing effort and infrastructure that are prone to pretty serious breaks.
Yeah, but I think it's also because they're still looking at it as a numbers game. So, for example, I just went through this with the CEO of a company I'm working with who was concerned that, he wanted to make sure that 2,000 leads were generated from a specific event or what have you. And I said, okay, look, last year you generated 1,756 in quotes leads. You actually sold 2 of them. What if this year we can put a program together where you get 500 real high quality leads and you can close 150? Wouldn't that be better? And he's like, well, I don't know, 2,500.
Are you kidding?
And no, and I'm kind of like, okay, wait, we're looking at this wrong. It's not about the number of leads. It's about the quality of the lead. I still have marketers that I work with who are being evaluated on performance based on the number of leads they produce for sales. If you give sales 1,000 leads and 900 of them are crap, what kind of relationship are you going to have with sales? And by the time they dig through them all, how many of the good ones have gone and bought somewhere else? If you give them 100 leads and they can close 60 of them, then what? Hallelujah. And so I think, we get ourselves all screwed up thinking quantity, and sales still plays that game. You have to make so many dials in order to get so many meetings. And then out of so many meetings, you're only going to get so many sales. And so they work it into this numbers thing, but it's not a numbers thing. It's a quality thing. And I think that's what everybody's hoping will be the holy grail of account-based marketing and sales, is that we will now be focusing on the accounts that are most important to us and the best match for our solution, their problem. Right?
Well, one of the problems that I see in that with the lead generation expectation is when you're going after those ideal accounts, and let's say you're going to target 50 or 100, marketing is not going to, quote, generate, unquote, those leads. Those leads are identified, the accounts are identified, and in many cases, if you've got a decent sales team, they've already got relationships with people in those accounts. So the credit for generating an account needs to not be a key attribution factor. It needs to be about who's influencing, and are we both influencing the lead? Can we track engagement? Are we getting the lead engaged? And it needs to be a collaborative process with marketing and sales linking arm in arm, not with you didn't generate enough leads for me.
Well, right. That's the whole point too, is working together, because ABM is all about increasing reach within an organization, increasing engagement with the contacts that create that reach, and then building momentum. So it's all about influence, persuasion, engagement, and that has to be a joint effort. They're not saying, okay, wait, I'm in the consideration stage. I should reach out to marketing. No, wait, sales. They don't think like that. They think, I need this piece of information in order to move forward. Somebody give it to me. And so it's funny that we've drawn these lines in the sand. And the other thing that gets me is that statistic that's out there that buyers don't engage with salespeople until they're 60, 70% of the way through the process. In most of the persona calls I do, they're engaging at the beginning with salespeople, right? Because they're trying to figure out, can we solve the problem? Is it worth solving the problem? Can we solve it internally, or do we need to go outside? What's it going to cost to solve the problem? Who should we look at to solve the problem? And they're getting involved with salespeople at every phase in different ways, but it's not like, okay, let's do 70% of our work first and then we'll go talk to vendors.
Well, and waiting until your customer is 70% through the buying process is a great way to guarantee that you are not first in the competitive market.
Oh, sure. Somebody else will have influenced them by then.
You're guaranteed to have had somebody else influence them. That's how they form their vision. So it's silly to wait. And that's something that I've had to re-educate a lot of clients on, because they've kind of gone with this mode where they didn't used to think that way. They started thinking that way after marketers started promoting the idea that customers are 70% of the way through. Well, Ardath, I think we have run out of time here, so let's stop there. But this has been really interesting, and thank you so much for participating again today.
Oh, thanks for having me. You and I could just talk forever, so.
I know, we could. Thanks a lot. Wow, that was a whirlwind conversation. I think my biggest takeaway was why it's so important to do buyer research before branding. If you try to do these things out of order, you are not going to speed up the process. You'll just cost the company unnecessary time and money. So, get to know your audience before building your messaging and brand strategy. Otherwise, you're likely to lose credibility and reduce your sales effectiveness. You can get more information about Ardath and Marketing Interactions at marketinginteractions.com or visit propelgrowth.com/trendspotters and scroll to episode 14. There, you can find a transcript for this episode and links to Ardath's website, social profiles, and one of the books she authored called Digital Relevance. And while you're there, check out our other episodes. Each session dives into topics that help drive growth in your business. And join me in 2 weeks for our next talk.
Hey, thanks for listening. We hope you found value in today's episode and welcome your feedback. You can subscribe to the podcast via iTunes or Stitcher. We'd really appreciate your help with getting the word out about TrendSpotters. Could you please review us on iTunes and share the podcast on LinkedIn and Twitter? Thanks. For more insights on smart business growth, visit us at propelgrowth.com.